So we've been doing very well when it comes to adaptations lately, but there are four series that I want adapted the most, and I've tried to consider practical considerations. So as much as I would love to see the Sun Eater, it covers like 8 centuries for the series, which could pose some serious problems, like in world. Although the character stays looking similar, so maybe we could do Sun Eater. But I have four series that I the most want adapted that I also think it's plausible they could be adapted. Let's go. So first, some quick honorable mentions. Malazan Book of the Fallen would be sick. It would require a budget of $17 bazillion. Probably any Malazan adaptation would look very different from the books we got, which is fine. But it would feel like it would be more like an add-on. Like it wouldn't really be telling the same story in a similar way as the Malazan Book of the Fallen, unless it had a budget of $1 bazillion and 14 seasons and actors who didn't age, because I don't. Yeah. The Sun Eater would be sick. Similar reason, would require $1 bazillion budget. I mentioned it before. Dresden Files could happen. It's the one for honorable mentions that I'm like was the closest to also having a designated section. The aging could be tricky because some of the characters don't age and some do, and the series is going to take place over like 25 years. Although the main character ages 1 year per year, and most of the characters do. So on that hand, like it actually kind of works, and it has a small enough cast. Dresden could be a thing. Yeah, Dresden could be a thing. Anyway, so it gets a strong honorable mention. And then there's a bunch of series that I just don't think have like the momentum right now from modern audiences. Like The Black Company would be really cool. I would watch the crap out of it. I probably wouldn't get that big of a budget, and it would probably end up getting bought by some crappy place and was done terribly. That's just an instinct I have, that a Black Company adaptation would end up being bad. It might not end up being true. But we're going to get into the ones I most want to see. Let's go. So, coming in the number 4 spot, I have The Dandelion Dynasty by Ken Liu, which has a few things going in its favor. It's recently completed. It's not super popular, but also it's by, like, the author's more known, I think, for The Paper Menagerie, but he's won multiple awards, and also, I think it has a lot of pros for an adaptation. So, one, it is cinematic as crap. Like, it would just have so many rule of cool scenes, which I think for TV shows, like, is kind of important. It also, in terms of aesthetic, like the silk punk, and the setting, and like the focus on technology, and like the Krubins and all the stuff like that, are a very unique setting. And I think it, as much as I love The Song of Ice and Fire, Lord of the Rings, and Wheel of Time, which are the 3 main adaptations we've gotten, all 3 of those, just aesthetically, are pretty, like, kind of what non-fantasy fans expect, and I'd kind of like to see an adaptation of a series that is, for a fantasy series, an amazing fantasy series, that kind of isn't quite what people expect from fantasy, which is not to say it's better for that reason, but I just kind of would like to see a fantasy adaptation for something that's, I almost want to say, less stereotypical, even though, like, I think all 3 of those series are phenomenal. That being said, while it's very different, I think Dandelion Dynasty would scratch the Game of Thrones itch. In terms of style, I think it's a lot more similar to Game of Thrones than, like, Wheel of Time is. And, like, it could be an HBO show, and in some ways, like, not have a similar aesthetic, because, like, the architecture and, like, the color and a lot of stuff like that would be very different, but just kind of have, like, a similar feel. And then, as kind of a much smaller reason, there's just a scene in Wall of Storms that made me go, like, yeah, I'm going to need this to be a TV show. And for those who have read Wall of Storms, it's not one of, like, the 5 things you would think it is. I think I have a comment, so if you look through my Wall of Storms reactions, you can find it. But there would actually, like, the entirety of whatever season, I guess season 2, Wall of Storms would be absolute insanity. It has some moments that would be completely insane. Dandelion Dynasty, I think it just has a lot of cons for an adaptation. A lot of things that could make it very challenging. One is it's a very generational story. So for some characters, you'd probably have to cast multiple people, kind of like you did for House of the Dragon, because there are characters in this book who have scenes when they're very young and when they're pretty old, because it covers quite a long time. This is one. Some of these I'm like, this wouldn't even need that crazy of a budget. Dandelion Dynasty would need an insane budget. The cast would be huge. The locations would be huge. The story would be huge. You'd need a ton of CGI, a ton of like expensive practical effects, a lot of actors. Which, speaking of which, this series has a giant cast of characters, which for TV audiences could be challenging. I mean, for those of you who have watched Game of Thrones with people who have not read A Song of Ice and Fire, they cannot remember who people are. Even people who you're like, that's a pretty main character. They're like, Stannis, and who's Stannis? And I'm like, what do you mean who's Stannis? Like they basically, first time watching it, they'll remember who like Ned, Tyrion, Jon, Arya, Daenerys, and Sansa are. And then for the other people, it's like, yeah, that's the person. Books just are, it's easier to follow really large casts of characters, in my opinion. And the Dandelion Dynasty could absolutely have that problem. Now, is this something I personally would care about? No, I would still enjoy the series because I obviously know who the characters are. But in terms of its chances of being successful enough to get multiple seasons and to get adapted in the first place, I think that could be a serious problem. And also the pacing would be kind of weird because in book 1, 200 pages is like multiple wars. And in book 3, 200 pages is like a cooking competition. So it would be very unclear to me. Like, would they pace it similarly? Like, would you have a very sweeping season 1 that covers like all the events of Grace and Kings, and then like a much more zoomed in like season 3 and 4, or just one massive season 3 if we really want to turn it into one story? Or do you make it paced more uniformly, and do you make the events of Grace of Kings like 2 seasons, and the events of Veiled Throne and Speaking Bones 1 season? And that could pose some serious challenges on just like figuring that out. That being said, like this is one of the ones that on the list that all the ones above this I think are more likely to actually happen. I would be shocked if a Dandelion Dynasty adaptation actually happened, but I just think the upside for a Dandelion adaptation would be so sick that I'm including it on this list. Okay, coming in at number 3, and since these are in order, some people may be surprised this isn't one. But the series I want adapted the third most is The Live Ship Traders by Robin Hobb. Yes, not all of Realm of the Elderlings. I don't really think Farseer would work that much. I think to make a Farseer adaptation that resembles the Farseer trilogy, you would have to like almost rewrite the script as if it was Farseer but told from multiple perspectives. So you would adapt it as if it was a book series with like Verity point of views and Patience point of views and Fitz point of views, and we ain't about that. And then there's aging up things, and there's also a bunch of stuff with the skill and wit that are all internal, and no, we're leaving that out. And it's 16 books, and that's going to be hard to do. But I think the Live Ship Traders could work phenomenally. And I think there's a lot of things in its favor. The most obvious is I just think the character work is phenomenal and could easily translate into phenomenal TV show characters. Like, Robin Hobb is one of the authors who you could just like copy paste the dialogue from the books and just be like, here's the script. It also wouldn't require an insane budget. Like really the only CGI you'd have to do would be like the talking boats and, some other stuff, but it wouldn't require an insane budget. Nothing like hugely major. Mostly the sets would be like boats, towns. Like it shouldn't be huge. It's a completed series. And it's a completed series that isn't ridiculously long. Like it's a good length for a TV series. You could do 3 long seasons or 6 short seasons. I think its style of storytelling would translate very well to screen. It's got a lot of dialogue, a lot of meaningful character interactions. And I think it could work extremely well in a TV show form. Pacing wise, I think actually the pacing for it would work quite well. And also, it's just my favorite series ever. So I want it adapted. Okay, leave me alone. It does have a couple cons. The first is that only doing live ship and not the rest might piss off a lot of Remley Otherlings fans, although I think they would come to see reason. But it could work. I still think it could be really good. As far as I know, Hobb doesn't actually want an adaptation. Which is kind of why, even though I'd be like really happy if I got this adaptation, like I don't push for it as much as some of the other ones. I think she's very attached to like her characters. So as long as that's true, like it's probably not going to happen. As I mentioned, I think you kind of really could only do live ship. I guess you could do Rainwilds, but I think it's most likely that it would just be like just live ship, which I would be very happy with. And one problem, which this is one that for those of you who haven't read live ship, you'll be like, what? Is Kennit poses some challenge. Because Kennit, let's put it this way, not having access to his thoughts could really, like I would have to deal with people being like, they did Kennit dirty and Kennit fanboys because they didn't read the books, and it could cause problems for his character arcs. The difference between how he thinks and how he acts is a really important part of his character, and it's going to be hard for it to come across, and there's going to be some things that happen that feel like they're out of left field, when in the books it's less out of left field because you're in the guy's head. That being said, there are cons to that. I still want it, and I think like these top 3 I think would be amazing. And coming in at number 2, and unlike the other ones, this is one that probably will happen. And that is, of course, the Stormlight Archive. There's probably going to be a Stormlight adaptation. And I think it has a lot going in its favor. The first is that it's a really unique world. As I said before, and actually I forgot The Witcher before, but the 4 fantasy live-action TV shows aesthetically are all more like stereotypical medieval fantasy. Now again, I don't think the storytelling is like stereotypical or cliche, but just aesthetically, they almost kind of fit the stereotype more, and I think it'd be really nice to have an adaptation from a world that's just visually completely different than what people would expect. I also think the cast of characters would translate really well to television. There'd be lots of characters like to love and to root for. There'd be lots that would be like really hateable, and I think them being hateable would translate really well to TV. And also, there's a lot of characters that kind of like are familiar in their own way, like kind of have a role, but are all unique in their own way. I also think the way Sanderson paces chapters could work really well for TV. Like almost every chapter is its own mini arc. There's a lot of like mini setup payoffs, and there's a lot of like constant payoff throughout the books. Obviously the Sanderlanche would be insane. Like if their Stormlight TV show is done well, it will become a thing where people are like waiting for the season finale, because the season finale like of Way of Kings, Words of Radiance, Oathbringer, and Rhythm of War, so seasons like 1, 2, 3, and 4 presumably, will be absolutely bonkers. Like if done well, they could be some of the most bonkers television that has like ever been around, and the people who have not read the books will not be ready for it. Also, Brandon, the author, is enthusiastic about adaptations and willing to like actively work on any project, and I think he has like the metal he can burn that gives him more time, and he actually can just do like work on all of these other things while still being able to pump out books. And I think he actually has like a 36-hour workday, and he just stole 12 hours from the rest of humanity. Also, even though like some of the sets will be very expensive, another pro is a lot of fantasy novels have a huge amount of locations. Stormlight, even though it would be very expensive, has less traveling than some other fantasy novels, which some people have as a criticism of a novel, but for an adaptation, it works a lot better. One of the struggles for adapting Eye of the World is Eye of the World has like 9 distinct locations for one section where they're traveling, and the people making the show were like, we can't make all 9 of these sets. But for Stormlight, you could have every set, because a lot of time is spent not traveling. And also, as a side note, fans for Stormlight, when people of color get cast, should have no reason to get upset although I'm sure they will anyways. This also applies for the Dandelion Dynasty. I'm sure it'll happen anyways, but I mean, we'll get to make fun of them for even more. It also, I think if it's successful, because of its like completely different aesthetic, it would open up the possibility for adaptations of fantasy series that have a different aesthetic. I think Game of Thrones led to a bunch of people trying to create the next Game of Thrones. And you ended up with settings that are at least like things that are kind of close. I think a more different series in terms of visual aesthetic, and stuff like Spren and all this crazy stuff could open up, if it's successful, like if a bunch of people watch it, could open up producers to be like, oh, okay, for fantasy, we can actually like cast our search wider and, you know, do a bunch of wild things and maybe consider series that they wouldn't have considered before. Maybe like the Dandelion Dynasty, for example. And also for last pro, I think, conversation, like the way Spren exists could actually be really useful for television. Spren, like a lot of things that are only visible internally in novels become visible externally, like emotional Spren, or when characters are like working things out, they'll talk to their Spren instead of just like thinking about it. So you end up with more natural scene instead of having to info dump what the person is thinking, which could be helpful. Now Stormlight also has a lot of cons, a lot of problems. It would require a huge budget. Fortunately, Stormlight sold a lot of books, so it's getting a huge budget. It's not like one of the things, like if Dandelion Dynasty had sold 20 million copies, I wouldn't be that worried about it getting the budget. But one of my concerns with Dandelion Dynasty is it hasn't sold 20 million copies. Unfortunately, please go buy and read the Dandelion Dynasty. But Stormlight, like, it's going to need a big budget. Also, they're long, and a lot of times they're meandering, and a lot of like the interludes. As much as it hurts me to say it, they'll probably cut most of the interludes. Like, you would have to build an entire set and cast all these actors to do like one scene, and then we don't see them again either ever or for like 6 seasons. These also would probably require just generally cutting more than the Live Ship Traders or the Dandelion Dynasty or the series I have at 1 here. And also, there's like the format of the series being split into 2 5-book arcs with a long time gap in the middle, and flashbacks, and like weird in-world races, like Parshendi, who are they shouldn't be a problem. We got CGI, but also like people are gonna, because a lot of like the humans, like the characteristics, don't quite match up with real world races. Like, there aren't actually people on Earth who look Alethi. They're like kind of, just in terms of characteristics, have slightly different characteristics. Now, there are some people who look a lot more Alethi than like I do. I don't look Alethi at all. But you know what I mean. The flashbacks could be challenging. So I think just the format creates a lot of practical issues. It's going to need a lot of CGI. This is probably the series on here that would require the most CGI, where there's the most, like, can't really do that practically. Like, Syl is a CGI character. Sorry, Syl. Pattern is all the Spren are CGI characters. Chasm Fiends are CGI. People fighting in Shardplate, CGI. A lot of CGI. And obviously, this is the only series I have on here that's incomplete. Only 4 of 10 books are done, or even 4 or 5. I don't know how book 5 is going to end. It's possible book 5 ends in a way where you could just, like, have a TV show called, like, The Stormlight Archives or something, and then later you could have a different TV show with, like, a different name, and it's, like, a continuation or something. But right now it's not done. The first arc will be done. It's unclear whether you could do a television show just based on the first arc, or whether they would realistically have to wait for all 10 books to be done. So Stormlight has a lot of pros, but also a lot of cons. But it's the one that's most likely to actually happen. So I'm really, really, really excited for it, because I've been waiting for it to get adapted since, like, 2014 or something, when I read The Way of Kings. Okay, the series that I think would work the best as an adaptation is the Sarantine Mosaic by Guy Gavriel Kay. It's got a lot in its favor. And I also have the least cons for it. And I also just love it. Like, I really love all these series. Like, I'd be really happy about any of them. But let's go through why I think the Serentine Mosaic specifically would work so well. It's almost paced like a TV show. Like, each chapter in the Serentine Mosaic is almost like a self-contained narrative. Like, book 1 is 10 chapters. It could just be 10 episodes, and each episode is a chapter. Like, if the prologue could almost be an episode. It just works very well at moving this narrative onto television. Yes, the chapters are somewhat non-linear, but they still work, and also all of them tell somewhat self-contained narratives, because it's like a mosaic, where it's not literally a mosaic, like a mosaic novel, where you just have, like, you know, a bunch of, like, almost self-contained short stories, but it's more mosaic-esque than it is, like, front-to-back narrative than most other novels, and it's got long chapters with self-contained narratives, with, like, setup and payoff. You barely would need any CGI for the Serentine Mosaic. Like, the setting is just, like, Byzantium in the 6th century. There's, okay, there would need some CGI, but there's very little, like, super fantastical stuff that would need, like, a high CGI budget or CGI that have the potential to look crap. Also, the dialogue is really, 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 really good. And it's another one of the series where you could just, like, take the dialogue and directly put it on TV. Because I think it's been somewhat established, if you watch Season 6 of Game of Thrones, that a lot of the time the people who write for TV shows, not for their own fault, but just because are not in contention for the best dialogue writers on the planet, while people like George R.R. Martin, Robin Hobb, and Guy Gavriel Kay are. So, you know, you can watch Season 6 of Game of Thrones, and you can see a line, and you can be like, that's a D&D line. That's a George Martin line. Serentine, I think, is really a series where you could, like, I don't know how much dialogue the TV show writers would actually have to write. Like, they would have to actually write very few lines of dialogue. They could probably write 0 lines of dialogue. They could probably just copy-paste for dialogue, which makes it much easier for them. I also think, in terms of cast of characters, it's a fantastic combination of moral complexity and characters who are not, like, purely good or purely evil, while still having a number of characters that the audience, like, can actually cheer for. It's not like The First Law, where, like, everyone is kind of terrible, and we'd have to sell people on it, be like, yeah, we should watch this, it's really fun, but also everyone's kind of terrible. It would also get some historical fiction fans. Like, I think it would draw people who are not as much into fantasy, who are just like, oh, this is based on, like, the Byzantine Empire, cool. It also, similar to Dandelion, it has similar enough to draw in, like, the Song of Ice and Fire fans. Like, it's a lot more similar to A Song of Ice and Fire than Wheel of Time or Rings of Power is. So I think there are probably some Game of Thrones fans, like the TV show Game of Thrones fans, not necessarily book fans, who were really into Game of Thrones, but then didn't even try or bounced off Wheel of Time, and probably would have bounced off Wheel of Time even if Wheel of Time adapted Eye of the World as well as Season 1 of Game of Thrones adapted the novel of Game of Thrones. But I think this would hold more appeal to them, which is kind of a huge section of the fantasy TV show adaptation audience. It's short enough. It's also short, like, relatively short. You could do it in 2 seasons, like, no problem, or even 1 really big season. And you shouldn't need to really cut corners. Like, I think you realistically could put essentially every scene in a TV show. Guy Gavriel Kay is also totally open to an adaptation. Like, Guy Gavriel Kay, there was a Fiona Var adaptation in the work, which I think fits an adaptation much worse, is just less good, and would require a massive budget, and would have less mass appeal. But the author is very open to an adaptation. I don't mean to insult Fiona Var, I just think Serentine is better for an adaptation. It also would open up the idea of doing, like, the entire Jadverse, so doing Guy Gavriel Kay's entire connected universe, like, in chronological order, with a bunch of, like, standalone seasons. So if Serentine did super well, like, I could totally see whatever studio did it, hopefully HBO, being like, oh, let's do, like, a Lines of Our Song TV show, and Serentine is first chronologically, so you could do that. Also, this novel should, I I think this series has the fewest practical difficulties. If I was thinking like, all right, we need to make a TV show for all these, all the others, like I run into practical difficulties of like, okay, but how do you convey this scene? Like this character arc seems really difficult. That's gonna take a lot of money. I think 17 just doesn't have as many when it comes to like casting. Or like characters aging out. It doesn't cover a huge amount of time, but it also doesn't cover it covers a similar amount of time that it would take to film it. So like aging out isn't going to be a problem. Also, again, 17's just excellent, so it has that in its favor. So we got cons. I tried to come up with, I only came up with 2. And this isn't really a full con, but I think this is just less likely to happen than Stormlight. It's actually, like, I wrote less likely to happen on here, because Guy Gavriel doesn't quite sell as well as others. But that's really only in comparison to Stormlight, or like Game of Thrones, are the ones that have already happened. But I think it's still a lot more likely to happen than a lot of other series. And the only other problem is it loses the Guy Gavriel prose boost. Like, a lot of scenes in his novels are amazing because of, like, the imagery is so, like, evocative and, like, stands out in my mind. And so they'd have, like... Gary is one of the few authors where it's, like, if there's a scene that doesn't look right, I'll be more annoyed by it. Because in my head, like, it's pictured so clearly, and there's some, like, very specific imagery. This comes up for those who've read Lines of Our Song for, like, the final scene in, like, not the epilogue, but, like, the final actual chapter. Like, if that isn't captured right, even if plot... Like, Guy Gavriel is one of the only ones where it's, like, the plot could follow, but if it doesn't look right, it could be more annoying. But I don't know. I just don't think that's that much of a problem. So, yeah, that's what I got for my top 4. And then I had a bunch I couldn't decide for top 5. So let me know which series do you think are most likely to be adapted? Would you be excited for these to be adapted? And let me know which series do you think you would most want adapted, and which series, like, of those, how likely do you think it is to come? I'm curious to see if you guys agree with me for these 4. I think these 4 would be pretty fantastic. But yeah, anyway, let me know what you think. I kind of had fun coming up with this list. Have a nice day, everyone.